On our anniversary, my wife shocked me by revealing she was leaving for another man. My name is Daniel, and I'm 28 years old. I'm your average guy living a pretty normal life, or at least that's what I thought until everything fell apart. You know how people say life can change in a single moment? I always thought it was a cliché, but on my 10th wedding anniversary, I learned just how true that really is. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. 10 years of marriage, that's something, right? I had spent weeks planning the perfect evening. We were going to this upscale restaurant downtown, one that we couldn't really afford when we first got married but had always dreamed of visiting. I managed to get a reservation, even though they were booked months in advance, and everything was set. I even bought her a diamond bracelet that I knew she had her eyes on for months. It wasn't the biggest or the most expensive, but I thought it was a meaningful gift for all we had been through together. But none of that mattered. The evening started off normal enough. Grace, my wife, was her usual self, maybe a little quiet, but I chalked it up to nerves or maybe the stress from work. She's a marketing executive and has always had a high-pressure job, so it wasn't out of the ordinary for her to seem distracted at times. But looking back now, there were signs that I missed. Hints that something much darker was happening right under my nose. We arrived at the restaurant, and everything seemed fine. The place was as beautiful as we had imagined. Dim lighting, candles flickering on every table, and a stunning view of the city skyline. We sat down, ordered our meals, and for a moment, I let myself relax. This was going to be the perfect night. And then she said it, out of nowhere, just like that. "I'm leaving you." I laughed at first, thinking she was joking. I mean, who says something like that on their anniversary? But she didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She just stared at me, her face cold and serious, as if she had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. Maybe she had. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking, but I already knew, deep down, that this wasn't a joke. My heart started racing, and my palms were suddenly sweaty. The room felt too small, the walls closing in. "I'm leaving you, Daniel. I've been seeing someone else for a while now, and I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." She said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, like she was telling me that she had to work late or that we were out of milk. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She was just done. Like our 10 years together, the life we had built, the memories we shared, they were just over, as simple as that. I sat there, stunned, not even sure how to respond. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she had just said. Another man? How long had this been going on? Who was he? Why didn't I see this coming? A million questions flooded my brain, but I couldn't get a single word out. "Who?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. She looked down at her hands, avoiding my eyes. "His name is Kyle. We met through work. He's different. He understands me in a way that you don't. Different. Understands her in a way I don't." What the hell did that even mean? I wanted to scream, to yell at her, to demand answers, but all I could do was sit there, frozen in place, while my entire world collapsed around me. "How long?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "A year," she said, still not looking at me. "It started about a year ago. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it just did. And now, I'm in love with him." A year. A whole damn year. While I was going about my life, thinking everything was fine, my wife had been sneaking around behind my back with another man. And now, on our anniversary, she was telling me she was leaving me for him. How do you even process something like that? How do you respond when the person you've built your entire life with tells you that they don't want you anymore? I wanted to be angry. I wanted to lash out, to tell her how much she was hurting me, how she was destroying our family. But instead, all I felt was numbness. Like I had been hit by a freight train, and my body was in shock, trying to catch up with what was happening. "Why now?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "Why are you telling me this now? On our anniversary?" She finally looked up at me then, her eyes filled with something that almost looked like pity. "Because I couldn't keep lying to you anymore. I thought tonight. I thought it would be the right time. I'm sorry, Daniel, but I need to move on." "We both do. Move on? How was I supposed to move on from this?" How could she sit there and say that like it was the easiest thing in the world? I felt like my heart had been ripped out of my chest, but she was just sitting there, calm and composed, like this was just another conversation about where to go for dinner. I wanted to ask her if it was worth it. This man, this Kyle, was worth throwing away everything we had built together. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew that for her, the answer was already yes. I don't remember much of what happened after that. Everything became a blur. I think the waiter came by to ask if we wanted dessert, and I just stared at him blankly until he walked away. Grace sat there across from me, still so calm, so composed, while my entire world was falling apart in front of my eyes. I felt like I was living in some sort of nightmare, but I couldn't wake up. The woman I had loved for over a decade, the woman I had built my life with, was sitting across from me telling me it was all over, just like that. Eventually, I must have stood up. I don't remember deciding to, but suddenly I was on my feet, walking out of the restaurant without saying a word. I heard Grace call my name behind me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I needed to get out of there, to get away from her, from everything. I stumbled out into the cool night air, the sounds of the city swirling around me. Cars honked, people laughed, and the world went on like nothing had happened. But for me, everything had changed. My legs felt weak, like they could give out at any moment, but somehow, I kept walking. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to move. How had this happened? How had I been so blind? I thought back over the past year, trying to piece together the moments I had missed. Had there been signs? There must have been, but I hadn't seen them. I had been too busy with work, too caught up in my own life to notice that my wife was slipping away from me. Maybe that was it. Maybe I was too focused on my job, on making enough money to provide for us, that I forgot about what really mattered. I had been working long hours, trying to climb the corporate ladder, thinking I was doing the right thing for our future. But was I? Maybe in the process, I lost sight of what was happening right in front of me. I thought about the nights I had come home late, exhausted, barely able to muster a conversation before collapsing into bed. Grace had always seemed understanding, telling me she knew I was working hard for us. But now, looking back, I wondered if that was just an excuse she had made to herself. Maybe she had already checked out long before I realized it. A year. That's how long she said it had been going on with this Kyle guy. A whole year. It felt surreal to even think about. While I was at work, she was with him. While I was planning our anniversary, she was probably planning how to tell me she was leaving. How had I not seen this? I kept walking, not sure where my feet were taking me. The streets were crowded with people, couples, friends, tourists, all going about their lives like it was just another Friday night. I felt like a ghost among them, invisible and disconnected from the world. The city that I had once loved now felt foreign, cold, and unwelcoming. I finally stopped when I reached a park, a quiet, dark corner of the city where I could be alone. I sank onto a bench, my head in my hands, and let the reality of what had just happened crash over me. Grace was leaving me. She was in love with someone else. She had been for a year, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, I heard footsteps approaching. I didn't bother looking up. I figured it was some random stranger walking through the park, and I didn't have the energy to care. But then I heard her voice. Daniel. I looked up, and there she was. She had followed me. Can we talk? She asked softly. I wanted to tell her no. I wanted to tell her to go to hell, to leave me alone like she had planned. But I couldn't. I still loved her, despite everything. So I nodded. She sat down next to me on the bench, close but not too close. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things that had been left unsaid for too long. I'm sorry, she finally said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Sorry didn't fix anything. It didn't erase the fact that she had been lying to me for a year. It didn't make it hurt any less. I never wanted to hurt you, she continued. I never wanted any of this to happen. But it did. And I don't know how to go back. You don't, I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. You don't go back from this? She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. It was the same ring I had given her on our wedding day, the same ring that had symbolized our love, our commitment to each other. Now it felt like a cruel joke. Do you love him? I asked, the words catching in my throat. It was a stupid question. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it. Yes, she said softly. I do. The final nail in the coffin. How long have you been planning this? I asked. Leaving me, I mean. She hesitated, and I could tell she didn't want to answer. But eventually she did. A few months. I didn't know how to tell you, or when. I thought tonight might be the right time. The right time? I repeated, incredulous. You thought our anniversary was the right time to tell me you've been cheating on me for a year and that you're leaving me for someone else? She winced at my words, but I didn't care. I wanted her to feel the pain that I was feeling, even if just for a moment. I didn't know how else to do it, she said. I couldn't keep lying to you. You deserve the truth. The truth. I laughed bitterly. The truth is you've been lying to me for a year, Grace. A whole year. And now, all of a sudden, you want to be honest. She looked down again, and for a moment, I thought I saw tears in her eyes. But I didn't care. Not anymore. I'm sorry, she whispered again. I stood up, unable to sit there any longer. I couldn't be near her. Not right now. Maybe not ever. I need some time, I said. I don't know what to do with this. With us. I just need time. She nodded, her own tears finally spilling over. Take all the time you need. I'll stay with my sister for now. I'll give you space. And just like that, it was over. 10 years of marriage, of love, of memories, gone in an instant. I walked away from her, from the park, from everything we had built together, not knowing if I'd ever be able to come back. The days that followed were a blur of confusion, anger, and sadness. Grace had left that night to stay with her sister, just like she said she would, and suddenly, our house felt more like a tomb than a home. I spent the next few days walking around the place like a ghost, unsure of what to do with myself. It was strange being alone in the house. Her things were still everywhere. Her clothes, her books, even her favorite coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter, untouched since the morning of our anniversary. Every corner of the house reminded me of her, of us. Every picture on the wall, every piece of furniture we had picked out together, it all felt like a cruel reminder of the life we had built and how quickly it had fallen apart. I tried going to work, thinking that maybe some kind of routine would help distract me, but it didn't. Sitting in my office, pretending to care about deadlines and emails, felt pointless. All I could think about was Grace and that night, her calm, steady voice telling me she was leaving, the way she said she loved someone else. It played over and over in my mind like a broken record. And then there was Kyle, the man she had left me for. I didn't know much about him, other than that they worked together and that he was different, in some way Grace never bothered to explain. But that was enough to fuel my anger. I found myself obsessing over the details. Who he was, what he looked like, what he had that I didn't. I imagined them together, laughing at me behind my back for the past year. The thought made me sick, but I couldn't stop myself from going down that dark path. A few nights later, I hit a breaking point. It was late, maybe 2 a.m, and I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with thoughts I couldn't escape. I hadn't spoken to Grace since she left. I didn't know what she was doing, where she was staying, or if she was with him. I hadn't even told anyone what had happened. It felt too shameful, too raw to share with anyone. But that night, the silence in the house was too much. I needed to talk to someone, anyone. So I did what I never thought I would. I called my best friend, Mike. Mike and I had been friends since college. We were roommates freshman year and had been close ever since. He was the kind of guy who always had your back, no matter what. He had seen me through some rough times before, but nothing like this. I hesitated for a long time before picking up the phone, not wanting to burden him with my problems in the middle of the night, but in the end, I dialed his number anyway. He picked up on the second ring, sounding groggy and confused. Dan? What's up, man? It's like 2 a.m. Is everything okay? I couldn't even get the words out at first. My throat felt tight, and my chest was heavy, like I couldn't breathe. Grace, she's leaving me, I finally choked out. There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment, and then Mike's voice, more alert now. What are you talking about? What happened? I told him everything. About the anniversary, about her telling me she had been seeing someone else for a year, about Kyle. The whole story spilled out of me in a rush, like I had been holding my breath for days and could finally exhale. Mike listened quietly, not interrupting once. When I was done, there was a long pause before he finally spoke. I don't even know what to say. That's messed up. I'm so sorry. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Yeah, it's a lot. I had no idea things were bad between you two, he said, his voice soft with concern. You never mentioned anything. That's because I didn't know, I admitted. I thought we were fine. I thought everything was normal. Turns out I was wrong. Mike let out a long sigh. Man, I don't know what to say. That's brutal. But listen, you're gonna get through this, okay? I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you will. You're one of the toughest guys I know. I wanted to believe him, but right then, it didn't feel like I'd ever get through it. How do you move on from something like this? From knowing that the person you love doesn't love you anymore, and hasn't for a long time? I don't know what to do, I confessed, my voice cracking. I feel like my whole life just fell apart. I can't even think straight. Mike was quiet for a moment, and then he said, why don't we grab a drink tomorrow? Get out of the house for a bit. I think you need it. I hesitated. The idea of going out and pretending to be normal felt impossible. But at the same time, sitting alone in my house, drowning in my own thoughts, wasn't doing me any good either. Yeah, I finally agreed. Maybe that's a good idea. The next evening, I met Mike at our usual bar, a small, dimly lit place we used to hang out at after work back in the day. It had been a while since we'd gone, but it still felt familiar. As soon as I walked in, I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and sadness. It was a reminder of simpler times, before everything had gotten so complicated. Mike was already there, sitting at a booth in the back with 2 beers in front of him. He waved me over when he saw me. "Hey man," he said, standing up to give me a quick hug. "How you holding up?" I shrugged as I sat down, taking a long sip of the beer in front of me. "I don't know. Honestly, I feel like I'm still in shock." Mike nodded, his expression sympathetic. "That makes sense. I can't even imagine what you're going through right now." For a while, we just sat there, drinking in silence. I appreciated that Mike didn't try to fill the space with meaningless words. He just let me sit with my thoughts, which was exactly what I needed. After a while, he spoke up again. "So, what now? Have you talked to her since she left?" I shook my head. "Oh, I don't even know what to say to her. What's the point? She's in love with someone else. What can I possibly say that will change that?" Mike leaned back in his seat, looking thoughtful. "I don't know, man. Maybe there's nothing to say right now. But you should still talk to her eventually. Figure out what the next steps are." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Yeah, I know. I don't think I'm ready for that yet." "Take your time," Mike said. "You don't have to rush anything. Just focus on taking care of yourself right now. You've been through a lot." I nodded, grateful for his support. "Thanks, man. I don't know what I'd do without you." "Hey, that's what friends are for," he said with a small smile. "We'll get through this. One day at a time." We stayed at the bar for a few hours, drinking and talking about anything but Grace. Mike told me stories from work, shared funny memories from our college days, and did his best to distract me from the mess my life had become. For the first time in days, I actually felt a little bit lighter. Like maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. But as the night wore on and I headed home, that familiar weight settled back on my chest. The house was still empty. Grace was still gone. And I was still left with a broken heart and no idea how to move forward. The days continued to drag on, each one blurring into the next. I thought time would make it easier to process everything, but if anything, it just made the reality of the situation sink in even more. Grace was really gone. Our marriage was over. And Kyle, this faceless man who had somehow inserted himself into our lives, was the reason why. I hadn't heard from Grace since that night in the park, and I didn't reach out to her either. I didn't know what to say, or even if I wanted to hear anything she had to say. She had already said enough. The few times I thought about texting or calling her, something inside me stopped. A mixture of pride and self-preservation, I guess. I wasn't ready to face whatever new pain that conversation might bring. But eventually, I couldn't avoid it any longer. It was about a week after she had left when I got the text. It was simple, almost too simple for the weight of what was happening. "Grace, we need to talk about the house. Let me know when you're ready." I stared at the message for a long time, the words staring back at me like a challenge. The house. Of course, it would come to this. We had built this life together, bought this home together, and now we had to figure out how to divide it. The thought made me sick, but I knew she was right. We couldn't avoid it forever. We had to deal with the logistics of ending a life we had spent so long building. But knowing that didn't make it any easier. I didn't respond to her right away. I wasn't ready. Instead, I tried to distract myself with work, with anything that would keep my mind off the fact that my marriage was unraveling in front of me. But no matter how hard I tried, it was always there, lingering in the back of my mind like a storm cloud that wouldn't go away. It wasn't until another few days had passed that I finally texted her back. "We can talk tomorrow after work. 6 p.m.? She replied almost immediately. "Grace? Okay. I'll come by the house then." The house. I hadn't even thought about seeing her again, about having her back in our home, the home we had shared together. The thought made my stomach churn. I wasn't ready for that, but I knew it had to happen. The next day was a blur of anxiety. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't think about anything other than seeing Grace again. Part of me wanted to confront her, to demand answers that I knew would only hurt me more. And another part of me just wanted to get it over with, to rip off the band-aid and move on with my life, whatever that looked like now. When I got home from work that evening, I felt like I was preparing for a battle. I sat in the living room, staring at the door, waiting for the inevitable knock. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be one of the hardest moments of my life. And then, at exactly 6 o'clock, there was a soft knock at the door. I stood up slowly, taking a deep breath before walking over and opening it. There she was. Grace stood on the doorstep, looking different. Or maybe it was just that I was seeing her differently now. She wasn't the woman I had known for 10 years. She wasn't my wife anymore. She was the person who had broken me, who had chosen someone else over the life we had built together. But despite everything, she still looked familiar in a way that made my chest ache. "Hi," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since that night. "Hi," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. My voice felt tight, strained, like I could barely get the word out. She walked inside, and the tension between us was thick, almost unbearable. This house, our home, suddenly felt like the last place I wanted to be. It was filled with too many memories, too many moments that now felt like they belonged to someone else. I could tell she felt it too. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar surroundings, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of sadness cross her face. But if it was there, she hid it quickly. "I guess we should get this over with," she said, her voice small but steady. I nodded, walking over to the living room and gesturing for her to sit down. She took a seat on the edge of the couch, while I sat across from her, as far away as I could. The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity before she finally spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about how we're going to do this," she said, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "About the house, about everything. I want to make this as easy as possible." "Easy?" The word felt like a slap in the face. Nothing about this was easy. But I bit my tongue and let her continue. "I don't want to drag this out any longer than we have to," she said, her eyes avoiding mine. "We can sell the house, split whatever we make. Or if you want to keep it, I can move out for good and we can figure out how to divide the rest." Her words felt clinical, detached. Like we were discussing a business transaction instead of the end of our marriage. I knew it wasn't her fault. This was just the way things had to be now. But that didn't make it hurt any less. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "I haven't even thought about it yet." She nodded, but I could tell she was disappointed. She had probably already made up her mind about what she wanted to happen and was hoping I would just go along with it. But I wasn't ready to make that decision. Not yet. "I get it," she said after a moment. "Take your time. I want to move forward, you know? For both of us." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time since she had arrived, I felt a surge of anger rising in my chest. "Move forward?" I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. "You've already moved forward, Grace. You've had a whole year to move forward. I'm the one still trying to figure out what the hell happened to my life." She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. I had been holding it in for too long, and it was finally starting to spill out. "You've been lying to me for a year. You've been sneaking around with him while I've been sitting here, clueless, thinking we were okay. And now, all of a sudden, you want to move forward? How am I supposed to do that?" Grace's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't stop. "I couldn't. You say you're sorry, but what does that even mean? You're not sorry for what you did, you're sorry you got caught. You're sorry it didn't work out the way you wanted. But you're not sorry for destroying everything we had. If you were, you wouldn't have done it in the first place." The words tumbled out of me, raw and unfiltered. I hadn't planned to say any of this, but now that it felt like a release. Like I had been holding my breath for months, and I could finally exhale. Grace wiped at her eyes, but she didn't respond. She just sat there, taking it all in, her face a mixture of pain and guilt. "I know," she whispered after a long silence. "I know I hurt you. And I'm not going to try to justify what I did, because I can't. You're right. I made a choice, and that choice hurt you. And for that, I'm truly deeply sorry." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't bring the comfort I thought they would. The damage had already been done, and no amount of apologies could fix it. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice softer now. "I don't know how to make sense of any of this." She nodded, looking down at her hands again. "I don't either. But we have to figure it out. For both of us." The rest of the conversation was a blur of logistics. Talking about the house, our finances, what we would do next. It felt cold, mechanical, like we were dismantling our life piece by piece. By the time she left, I was exhausted, emotionally drained. I watched as she walked out the door, the weight of everything finally settling in. This was it, the end of us. And for the first time since it all started, I realized that maybe I didn't want to fix it. Maybe I needed to let go, to accept that the life I had imagined for us was gone. And maybe that was the only way I could truly move forward. The days after Grace left for good felt like I was living in a fog, a strange mixture of freedom and suffocating loneliness. For 10 years, my life had been built around her, our routines, our future plans, everything. Now that she was gone, I didn't know what to do with all the empty space she had left behind. I spent a lot of time thinking about our marriage, replaying the memories in my head over and over. I thought about the early years, when we were both so happy, so in love, and so certain that we'd be together forever. And I thought about the slow unraveling, the cracks that had formed long before I ever noticed them. In hindsight, I realized there had been signs, little moments where something had shifted between us, where she had pulled away and I had been too distracted by work or too naive to see it. But none of that made it any easier to accept. I thought the pain would fade with time, that eventually, I'd stop feeling the sharp sting of betrayal every time I thought about her and Kyle. But the truth was, the pain was still there, lingering beneath the surface like an open wound that refused to heal. I couldn't shake the image of them together, couldn't stop wondering how long she had been lying to me, how long she had been living a double life. Some nights, I found myself staring at my phone, tempted to call or text her. I wanted answers, closure, something to help me make sense of everything. But I knew that wouldn't help. There was nothing she could say that would change what had happened. No explanation, no apology would ever undo the damage she had done. The hardest part was letting go of the anger. I had been so consumed by it for so long, angry at Grace for betraying me, angry at Kyle for taking her away from me, angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. But as time went on, I realized that holding on to that anger wasn't helping me. It was only keeping me stuck in the past, preventing me from moving forward. And so, slowly I started to let go. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the weight of everything felt unbearable, when I would wake up and the first thought in my head was of Grace and how she had ripped my life apart. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when I realized that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of my story. Maybe it was just the beginning of something new. One of those moments came about a month after Grace had left for good. I was sitting in my kitchen, staring at the divorce papers that had just arrived in the mail. It felt surreal, like a final nail in the coffin of our marriage. I stared at the papers for a long time, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to rip them up, to cling to the life we had built even though I knew it was already gone. But as I sat there, I realized that signing those papers wasn't just the end of something, it was also the start of something new. A new chapter, a new beginning. One that didn't involve Grace, but one that could still be meaningful, fulfilling. So I picked up the pen and signed. In the weeks that followed, I started focusing on myself for the first time in years. I went back to the gym, started running again. Something I had loved but had neglected during the stress of our marriage. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in a while, people I had unintentionally distanced myself from while I was trying to keep my failing marriage afloat. And slowly, bit by bit, I started to feel like myself again. It wasn't a sudden transformation. There were still bad days, still moments when the pain would creep back in, catching me off guard. But there were also good days, moments when I realized I was no longer defined by what had happened, by the way Grace had left me. I was more than that. I had a life to live, and I wasn't going to let her take that away from me. One evening, I found myself sitting in the same park where Grace had dropped the bombshell on our anniversary. It was a place I had avoided for weeks, but for some reason I felt drawn to it that night. The air was cool, the sun setting in the distance, casting a golden hue over the trees and the water. As I sat there watching the ducks glide across the pond, I thought about what Mike had said to me that night at the bar, that I was going to get through this one day at a time. At the time, I didn't believe him. I thought the pain would last forever, that I would never be able to move on. But sitting there, in that park, I realized he was right. I was getting through it. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but I was healing. Slowly, painfully, but surely. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Grace's name. For a moment, I considered calling her, asking her how she was doing, if she was happy. But then I stopped myself. What would be the point? I didn't need to know. Her happiness, or lack thereof, was no longer my concern. I was free of that burden. So instead, I deleted her number. It felt strange at first, like a part of me was being erased. But as soon as her name disappeared from my phone, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. And that's all I needed. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into my work, not as an escape, but because I found a new sense of purpose in it. I moved out of the house, our house, and into a smaller apartment across town. It was a fresh start, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. I didn't know what the future held for me. I didn't know if I would find love again, if I would ever trust someone the way I had trusted Grace. But I did know that I was stronger than I had been before. I had survived one of the hardest experiences of my life, and I had come out on the other side. Maybe not completely whole, but stronger, more resilient. As the months turned into a year, I found myself thinking about Grace less and less. The pain that had once felt like an open wound had become more like a dull ache, still there, but manageable. I no longer felt defined by her betrayal. I was more than the man whose wife had left him. I was Dan, a man with a future, a man who had survived. And in the end, that's what mattered. If you like such stories, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. It will be the biggest support for me.